Ahuru Sasa, which means freedom now in Keith Swahili. We have just completed the Jazz Zone with T in Providence, and joining us on the line is a regular on Diasporic Music, Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of African American Studies History at the University of Houston, and he's the author of approximately 50 books, and he is always supported diasporic music. We started with him many years ago, and I don't know if you knew it, Dr. Horne. I should have told you before you got on the phone, but Charles Roach's sister-in-law, Margaret Giddens, I think you're familiar with her, right?
Mm-hmm.
She passed away a couple of days ago, and Margaret Gittens was a friend and comrade of mine, and I had known her for many moons. Yeah, I think you may have met her in Cuba, I believe. Yeah, well, she is one of my closest comrades, and I'll say this and then I'll leave it alone. But I was in the hospital, she was in the hospital, and she had been looking for me basically to give me her all of the stuff she had on Africa. She was downsizing, and for whatever reasons, we never made the hookup, and she moved to California with her daughter, Lauren Gittens, and I don't know where that material went, but she had quite a collection which she wanted to, is the word bequeath, is that the correct word, sir?
Correct.
She wanted to bequeath that to me. But how are you doing today, my friend?
Hey, man, trying to figure out which direction this small planet is heading, and we'll touch upon that momentarily.
Well, let me ask you this. You know, like we want to talk about the NATO summit, but the NATO summit, NATO is was born the same year you were born, and you know, was supposed to be you know, to deter the expansion of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is, as Bobby Womack would say, is long gone. So what's the purpose of NATO in 2026?
Well, it shifted from being anti-Soviet to anti-Russian, rather seamlessly, I might add. But we should also keep in mind the other purposes of NATO, which was to keep the Yankees in and the Germans down. And those two priorities still obtain as well. What's concerning to me right now is, needless to say, the proxy war in Ukraine and the ability of the Ukrainians, clearly and evidently, with European and US assistance, being able to shoot projectiles ever deeper into Russian territory. Now, what's interesting is that Mr. Putin seems to be unruffled by this turn of events because, and I understand why, because these drone attacks by the Ukrainians have not shifted the overall strategic posture, meaning that Ukraine is on the back foot and Russia is not. However, I trust and I hope that the United Russia Party and Mr. Putin personally will pay more attention to the rumblings and grumblings from the pro-Russia solidarity movement, meaning the movement outside of Russia, not to mention internal rumblings and grumblings by some who feel that Mr. Putin has been too compliant when it comes to negotiating with Mr. Trump in particular. Now, I understand Putin's point of view. NATO without the United States is like Hamlet without the prince. I mean, it doesn't add up. And so Mr. Trump feels as well that if he can co-opt Putin, then that's a step towards getting closer to encircling the big enchilada, which is China. So both Trump and Putin have an interest in maintaining a certain kind of diplomatic relationship. The problem with that is that Mr. Trump is so erratic and mercurial. He goes hot and cold with regard to the proxy war. Everybody recalls what happened in the Oval Office about 15 months ago when, quite infamously, Mr. Trump told Mr. Zelinsky that he didn't have any cards. And then there was the Alaska summit in August 2025, where there were those who had thought that an understanding had been reached between Trump and Putin. And then there was this Ankara summit, wherein Mr. Trump once again said he was all in with regard to the proxy war and made a kind of fake deal with the Ukrainians in the sense that he said that the United States would arrange for Patriot interceptor missiles to be made in Ukraine. Now, it'll take a few years for that to come online. In a few years, this conflict could be over. That's why I call it a fake deal. But in any event, it does represent the sentiments of Washington towards this ever more concerning war, which brings us to Canada. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago expressing alarm, the alarm that they sensed in Ottawa concerning Mr. Trump's attempt to turn Canada into the 51st state. Reading between the lines, it was apparent that the Wall Street Journal journalists had Mark Carney, the prime minister, as a major source. I understand what Mark Carney is trying to do by cutting deals with China, by traveling repeatedly to West Asia, Saudi Arabia, etc., by trying to get ever closer to the European Union, for example. But wait, I'm getting these text messages. Oh, sorry about that. I thought it would have something to do with the transmission. But in any event, uh, I'm not sure if Mark Carney, being a hawk concerning Ukraine, is in the best interest of Canadian national security or Canadian sovereignty. I understand that he has a problem insofar as there is a formidable anti-communist base in Canada.
Yes, that's right.
Matter of fact, let me stop here and let you digress on that.
Well, I think in the Western province, the Western Alberta, a lot of the Western Canada is packed with Eastern Europeans, and they are many of them are formidable anti-communists, and Ukrainian, well, Eastern Europeans, and when I came to Toronto, when I say we, the African, Caribbean, and progressive communities would hold our meetings at the Ukrainian Hall. And I think that, years later, I think they were at that particular point, it was controlled by the progressive Ukrainians. Since that time, the right-wing Ukrainians have taken it over, and they might chase us away at this particular time. And there's a whole lot of sympathy for Ukraine. I mean, you could walk into corner stores, I don't want to name any names, but, famous corner stores, and they have signs of help the Ukraine, almost like down with Russia, give some money to the Ukraine. They have buckets where you could put in money. It's very, very many parts of Canada, Toronto included, are very sympathetic to Mr. Lewinsky and his regime.
Well, and also, Freeland joined the ranks of Zelinsky, I think.
I forgot about that. You're right,
Yeah,
Melinda.
yeah, yeah. That was just recently. She resigned, and she's in Ukraine now. So yeah.
You're speaking about a former high-level official in the Liberal Party who
Yes,
actually challenged Mark Carney to lead the party and become prime minister.
right.
Now working shoulder to shoulder in Kiev with Mr. Zelinsky. So this is a very serious question. But we should also ask the question on the outer horizon, which is whether whether NATO can continue to exist. I think that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has been looking for a mission. They found one with regard to Ukraine. But given the erratic nature of Mr. Trump, I'm not sure if the Ukrainian escapade is sufficient to knit together this rather cumbersome alliance. And it would not surprise me at all if NATO were to disintegrate in the next decade or so. I think, on the other hand, the capitalists of Western Europe, in many ways, have a better understanding of US politics than many in this country who consider themselves to be radical or revolutionary. What I mean by that is the Western European leadership, they do not necessarily see Mr. Trump as a singular figure, and that once he leaves, there can be a reversion to the so-called good old days when there was a solidarity in the alliance. They see Trumpism as a long-term phenomenon. And actually, I tend to agree with the Western Europeans in that regard. I think a lot of it, as I've said 100 times or more, ties into this rather naive conception that many on the left have towards the country in which they reside. They have this idea that when 77 million people vote for Trumpism, that it's a kind of accident, that they're actually social democrats yearning to breathe free. And then when social democrats do run, such as the mayor of New York City, and he wins every borough except the borough where the Euro-American settler descendant working class and middle class is centered, speaking of Staten Island, they ignore it. They have these theories of the case that are impervious to evidence. I mean, and then, as I've said before, sometimes they get insulted when you tell them that basically they're reflecting on Obama-ism. What I mean by that is, during Obama's 8 years in office, whenever there was something happening that he felt was not consistent with his conception of the United States moving towards a more perfect union, he would just say, that's not who we are. Well, in many ways, the US left has a similar position because since we supposedly had this grand revolution and they have not explained how that is consistent with mass enslavement and genocide against the indigenous and imperialist wars on every point of the planet, ultimately they're reduced to suggesting that everything is an anomaly, that whenever anything happens that's inconsistent with the conception of a grand revolution, well, that's not who we are. That's what I mean by Obama-ism. And so we're in very difficult shape here south of the border. I know that there are probably those in your audience who are tired of my saying that, but I continue to say it because it's not only an imminent danger to many of us south of the Canadian border, it's an imminent danger to international peace and security. Because this NATO summit not only took up the idea, as noted, of this proxy war in Ukraine, which could spin out of control at any moment, but also Mr. Trump has agreed to sell these F-35 fighter jets, sophisticated fighter jets to Turkey, over the objection of the Zionist lobby. You know that both the Netanyahu government and the so-called opposition would like to attack Turkey, believe it or not. They haven't gotten enough from the pasting they received from Iran. And so they're as mad as wet hens with Mr. Trump, given his deciding to sell these sophisticated fighter jets to Turkey because it upsets the military balance from their point of view. And I connect their upset with Mr. Trump over Turkey with his decision while in Turkey a few days ago to escalate against Iran, which is happening as we speak. In other words, Mr. Trump could not satisfy the Zionist lobby in Israel by joining in on an attack on Turkey, but he feels he can sate their wildest ambitions by joining in on an attack on Iran. And as noted, this is quite dangerous because Iran retaliates against the Gulf allies of the United States of America. And a la Ukraine, that conflict could spin out of control at any moment.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, and Dr. Horne, we are in the midst of fundraising for Diasporic Music in particular, and Black Power 93 in general. And I wanted to your analysis of why listeners should support Diasporic Music and Black Power 96.
Well, there's so many reasons. I think I said last week that if you compare some of the information you get on this station, on Black Power 96, even compared to some of our left-wing friends in the US independent media, particularly on a pressing issue like Syria, where there has been a clear line taken with regard to Syria, opposition to the US-Turkey-Israel attempt, successful as it turned out, to overthrow the al-Assad regime and replace al-Assad with a former al-Qaeda commander. That issue alone is sufficient for listeners to chip in, to go to their phones. And what's that number again, Melinda?
I can say the number, but I think right now people should go to their keyboard and go to blackpower96.org slash DM or slash donate. I'm not sure if we have phones right now, but I can give out the number. It is 1-888-979-2796, and I'll say it again, 1-888-979-BP96.
One more time.
1-888-979-BP96.
Okay, fair enough.
You have some more questions, Belinda?
Yeah, do we want to get deep? Do we want to get into Iran?
Well, I'll just expand upon this conflict. I mean, part of the conflict, which is unfolding as we speak, turns upon an interpretation of that rather brief memorandum of understanding brokered about 2 or 3 odd weeks ago between Iran and the United States, which, as noted, has upset the Zionist lobby and upset the Israeli regime in particular. Part of the controversy turns upon the Straits of Hormuz and whether or not those vessels that attempt to traverse this important artery, this important waterway, whether or not, like a driver on the highway, they have to turn over their license and registration, metaphorically and figuratively speaking, to the Iranians before they are allowed to proceed. The US side says that the memorandum of understanding does not allow for such. Part of the problem is that A, the Iranians are very good negotiators, and B, the US side was in a rush to come to an agreement because of the impact that this war was having on oil inventories, which are still in a very dangerously low level. In fact, which is one of the reasons I was rather taken aback that Mr. Trump decided to resume the conflict. And then the other factor, which we've talked about quite frequently, is that the United States has been running out of Tomahawk cruise missiles, running out of missile interceptor systems, similar to the deficit suffered by Israel. Once again, underlining why we were taken aback by the resumption of the war. And then, understandably, the killing of the supreme leader on February 28th and the attempted decapitation of the Iranian leadership has infuriated the surviving leaders. I understand that during that massive funeral for the Ayatollah and those who were killed with him just a few days ago in Tehran, that both the president and the foreign minister were not treated pleasantly because they are seen as forces who would like to compromise with the US and Israel. And compromise is not something that is longed for by many leaders of the Revolutionary Guard and other militant forces in Iran. So US imperialism, in a sense, has painted itself into a corner. We've made reference to this ongoing conflict in Ukraine and how US imperialism would like to turn its attention to the People's Republic of China. Well, the same holds true with regard to Iran. That is to say that this conflict hampers the ability of the United States to turn its attention towards China. And I think that the Israeli leadership and the Zionist lobby should take very seriously this gathering notion that by their hawkishness, they're compromising ultimately the metal of US imperialism, which in the long term is to the detriment of Israel, or at least Netanyahu, and to the detriment of the Zionist lobby for sure. That is where we stand.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, Melissa Watson on the buttons. Dr. Gerald Horne, there has been a young man that has been bugging me. He's dying to hear your analysis of Senegal. Now, we know that Senegal historically has been one of the most stable countries on the African continent, and its leader, the person that helped lead them to independence, was Leopold Senghor Gore. I guess he was the father of one of the fathers of the negritude, I believe, but brilliant intellectually, but politically not so tough. What's your take on the current situation in Senegal as we speak?
Well, the nation's in uproar. I mean, first of all, even though one of your listeners criticized me for talking about the World Cup, I'll mention that Senegal's in uproar because they didn't do very well in the World Cup. They just fired their coach, for example. And I think that has contributed to a certain kind of demoralization nationally, demoralization that is fed ostensibly by this conflict between the president and the prime minister. In other words, they have a system similar to that of the former colonial masters, speaking of France, where they have both a president and a fine prime minister. Now, the prime minister was supposed to have been the president. He's the senior member of the duo, but had some legal difficulties, and so he let his junior proceed to become president. But now they are in a dispute for various reasons. And so it's a very sticky situation. But I will say this. I don't know how far this is going to proceed, but there has been discussion, at least in certain circles in the United States, that with regard to the thousands of Haitians that are in the process of being ousted from this territory, from the United States, that we should arrange for a safe passage to West Africa. Cote d'Ivoire has been mentioned, Senegal has been mentioned. I'm not sure if those who've been mentioning that are sufficiently capable to execute such a formidable task, but I wish them Godspeed, and I hope that they're just not blowing smoke. Now, let me return in the time remaining to this issue, which I said a moment or two ago, we've been criticized for talking about the World Cup. But I think it's legitimate, even if you support the concept of a boycott of the World Cup, which I do. I don't think we should ignore what's going on, particularly the racism uh, by certain fans from Latin America, particularly Paraguay, the racism directed at Black Brazilians, for example. I think that part of our job as analysts is to have an understanding of the balance of forces. And if you have Black athletes who are being denounced and subjected to naked racism before global cameras, that shows you how brazen the racists are, which shows to a certain extent that they feel empowered. And our audience needs to know about that and needs to prepare accordingly. I mean, for example, you can support the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and still report on the activities of the white supremacists and racists who try to disrupt the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King led the manifestation, for example. And that brings me to another reality, which I think we might have mentioned last week, but I'm not sure, so I'll mention it again. The intervention by Mr. Trump after a Black player on the US team was subjected unfairly to an ouster, a red card. I don't know if I mentioned the fact that Mr. Trump came to his defense, even though he was a so-called birthright citizen. That is to say, he was
You did
born.
mention it last week.
Sorry?
So you did mention it. You
Oh,
did.
okay, fine. So that's something else that we need to know because we need to know what is in the arsenal of the antagonists of our enemies so that we can plan strategy and tactics accordingly. Sometimes I just think that there's a certain kind of ignorance, I'm afraid to say, among certain sectors of our community. And they would like all of us to be ignorant, just like they are, so they can feel more comfortable with their ignorance. But I'm afraid to say we're going to disappoint them.
Oh, Melinda. Oh, wait, Jerry, we only have like 3 minutes left. Any more questions you have, Melinda?
I don't know if you wanted to touch on the Indian summit, the Indian and
Well, I mentioned this on the Around the Horn program this past Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern, and I'll mention it again because I think it's of maximum importance, which is that assuming that somehow US and China get into a fracas, get into a mutually weakening conflict, waiting in the wings to assume global leadership is the India-Japan alliance, whose relationship stretches back to the founding of Buddhism hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, manifested during World War II when the Indian national hero Subhash Chandra Bose died fighting shoulder to shoulder alongside Japanese troops against the British. I mentioned on that program, and I think I put this in a book as well, the book Race War, that during the Tokyo war crimes trials, that when the defendants, the Japanese defendants in the courtroom, the Indian judge stood up as opposed to the other way around. That is to say, the defendant standing up and the judge enters the courtroom. And so Takeichi, the prime minister in Tokyo, and Prime Minister Modi had a very sumptuous summit, so to speak. And it's something to keep an eye on because it's not, I'm about, the next book I'll write, which will be in December, will be on China. And so I've been doing a lot of background reading on the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the things that strikes me about the Chinese Communist Party, and I may have said this before too, I'm afraid to say, is the factionalism at the highest level. And actually, Mao Zedong oftentimes was the main carrier of that particular tendency. And also the subjectivism. I mean, these leaders, they were spending so much time going after one another. And given the fact that President Xi Jinping has dismissed high-level officials in the foreign ministry, high-level officials in the military of late, I'm not convinced that factionalism has disappeared altogether. And I think that many were taken by surprise when the Soviet Union collapsed. People were not prepared. At least some people were not prepared. Some people, believe it or not, were cheering it on. And I don't think we should be in that position again. And that if by some stroke of fate, there are changes in China that are to the benefit of U.S. imperialism. Once again, our job is to analyze events to prepare our audience for virtually any eventuality.
And pardon me, and with that, I think we have run out of time, sir. Comrade, I guess we will see you next week, right?
Good luck to you.
All right. Thank Lisa for keeping us on point, keeping everything sounding perfect. And Melinda, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to remind the link is again blackpower96.org/DM and donate. We're going to be asking you all month. So yeah, and stay safe, and we'll see everybody in the Whirlwind next week.
And money, 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 money. It's about the money, right?
Yeah.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.